This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mr. F. D. Moon, interviewed by Pendleton Woods on April 11, 1972. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 15, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is April the 11th, 1972, and we're in Oklahoma City. I'm at the home of Mr. F. D. Moon, long-time Oklahoma educator. For over 20 years, the principal of Douglas High School. The F. D. Moon School in Oklahoma City is named after him, and he is currently serving on the Oklahoma City School Board. We will be talking with Mr. Moon principally about his experiences in the field of education, also possibly in other areas too of his own experience. But to begin with, Mr. Moon, I wonder if you would tell us where you were born and who your parents were and what your parents did.
Well, that's very easy. I'm not over 55 miles about from where I was born over in Lincoln County. My father and mother came to this state from Arkansas and homesteaded a farm just in Lincoln County, and I, along with several other children, was born there.
Did your parents make the run?
No, they didn't make the run of '89. My people homesteaded in 1892, and they reared the family. Altogether, there were 9 children of us, and I'm next to the youngest of those 9 children. They reared 9 of us out here on the farm over in Lincoln County, and we grew up out there.
You want to give me their names, your parents' names, your mother's name?
Oh, my mother was a very devoted Christian woman her name was Polly Moon. She never received beyond the 4th grade in education, but she had a great desire that her children should be educated. My father, Henry Clay Moon, was a farmer here in Oklahoma, and he did teach school in Arkansas. I mean, of an elementary type. He couldn't qualify, I'm sure, to teach under present day standards, but he did teach back in Arkansas, and he had good memory of locations in geography. In fact, he used to question me sometimes on some of my decisions.
Where in Arkansas did your family come from?
My father and mother came to Oklahoma from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and that's where most of my grandfather on my father's side and grandmother, all on both sides, from either Pine Bluff or in the region of Pine Bluff, Arkansas.
Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in pretty much a pioneer territory? You're about, what are you, about 70, how old are you now?
I'm 75.
75, so you were born there, which means that you first remember about the turn of the century, what it was like over there. Could you describe the Lincoln County area about the turn of the century?
Oh, I could probably describe the part in which I lived, because one's method of travel in those days was by wagon and horse and buggy, so you didn't cover long distances. I'd go to Kearney, which was 6 miles east, and to Merrick, 3.5 miles northwest, and Fallis, which was the post office, 4 miles south, and that was pretty well the range. Once in a while I did get to Wellston, which was 11 miles away, so my comprehension would cover a rather narrow range. I remember, of course, quite clearly the type of country in which I lived, and it prevailed, I think, pretty generally there. It was a forest covered area, and we had primarily what is called blackjack trees, and some post oak prevailed, and cotton was the principal crop, cotton and corn. And we had our little rural churches, which we were required to go to attend every Sunday morning. And if it rained on Sunday in our family, why, it was understood that you're going to have Sunday school at church. If it cleared off, it would come in the afternoon. And my mother was deeply religious and saw to it that we were always in church and Sunday school. And I remember now how when it was real cold, she'd take us. I'm next to the youngest in my family, and my brother, Dr. E.C. Moon, is the youngest, and she'd have us in the back of the wagon and covered with what they call comforters, kind of a quilt, heavy quilt, to protect you, but we went to church and Sunday school faithfully. In fact, she became very faithful and a prominent worker in churches in the territory of Oklahoma. In fact, she was president of the Territorial Convention of the Oklahoma Baptist Women's Convention and the organizer of the Northeast District Association for the Women's Convention, which still exists.
Do you feel this breaks a little away from chronology, but do you feel that this background, particularly this religious background, played a big influence on your later career?
Oh, without any doubt, it played an important part in my career. For you see, when I retired from Douglas High School, I hope I'm not running ahead. When I retired from Douglas High School, I was fortunate in having 8 offers as to jobs, but one of those was to become the executive secretary treasurer of the Oklahoma Baptist State Convention, and among others, and I analyzed each and placed the job opportunity against my personality and decided to accept that with the Baptist State Convention. And I've continued to work with them, not in the capacity of not only of executive secretary treasurer, but also later they wanted to build a youth camp and asked me to take the leadership, which I did, and we've gone a long ways toward building a youth camp in the northeast part of this county, 40 acres of land. Burgess Camp is northeast part of Oklahoma County, where we've spent it up to about $65,000-$70,000 out there to this time. But that was due, I'm sure, to my mother's deep religious influence that it has affected my life.
The swinging back into the earlier days, of course, you have a large family, you're in a new territory, and of course there's the economic problem of feeding that many people in a new territory. I'm sure there was a little work to do around home. Could you describe the life of growing up in a pioneer country at that time?
Yes, that's very vivid to me what we did in those days. As I say, my mother was very faithful in seeing that we went to church. She was likewise, both mother and father, to see to it that we went to school. But we were required to work. And so we raised cotton for the most part, and we had to engage in picking cotton. But when school opened, my mother saw to it, my parents saw to it, that we did attend school for the full length of a school term. Now, quite often in those early years, a school term was not more than 6 months, and later on they were extended to be 7 months. But we attended school full time. The school was in session, but after we came home, we would, if it was possible, we did work and milk the cows and learn to husk the corn and do all of those chores that usually prevail in rural areas.
You mentioned the influence of your mother in your early days. Can you think of any other people who, in the period, say pre-college period, who had particular influence on your life?
Well, I mustn't leave my father out. So many people have heard me speak over the years, and they say, well, Mr. Moon, I've heard you speak so much about your mother. I don't hear you speak of your father. Well, I said certainly my father had a great influence. He perhaps didn't have as great as my mother, but he was a very clean gentleman, a man of good character. And there's one thing that my father did that has impressed me all my life, even now. That was, he always said, my word is my bond. And I would tell children in school, if you get me to make a promise, I don't just make them so freely, but once you get me to make one, you can go to sleep on it. I'll keep those I make. I got that from my father. His word was my bond. He'd pay his debts, whether he had a mortgage on the crop or not. It's just his word. He promised to pay it, and he kept that promise. The neighbors, of course, we had good neighbors, Christian people for the most part, and I presume that that's had a great influence in my life as well, because that was the general way of the community, my small world, which wasn't very large.
Now, at the close of high school, what did you do then?
Well, I should add first that there was no high school in the community where I lived, and that was pretty general at that time. Especially, there weren't many for whites and practically none for Negroes. So that when I finished the common school, the 8th grade, unless my mother had the foresight, which she did, and my father joined in support of it, to let us, my brother and I, Dr. Moon, he is now a medical doctor, go to Langston University. Langston University in those days taught grades from about the 7th grade on up through high school and included the college. And so I went to Langston University when I was in the 9th grade. Now, we didn't have the money to finance our attendance and staying at Langston University, but we got jobs. And the first job I had was working at a little hospital, and then I milked cows and did jobs like that, ran the creamery, and was quite happy over it, and that's the way it was made possible for me to go through high school and then also college as well at Langston University.
How large was Langston at that time?
Old Langston at that time had an enrollment of about 1,000 students, because as I said, they included the grades and high school and college. So there were about 1,000 students, and I may be off some on it, but that was about what the enrollment at Langston University was in those earlier years.
You know, a portion was high school and college.
Very large portion of it was the high school, and then small number in college. but it was the only possibility for Negroes to get a college education because it would be near to them. So providing the college education for a small number, I think, could be justified because it was about the only opportunity they had to secure it. Now, I went through the high school there and then through what was called in those days normal, which covered 2 years of college, really 2 years above the high school. Much of it was in those days a preparatory experience for teaching. My certificate from Langston, my diploma from Langston University, from the normal course, 2 years, which was a life certificate, is on parchment and is much larger and on finer paper than my master's degree is from the University of Chicago.
What was your degree from Langston?
My degree was B.S., Bachelor of Science, and from Langston University. That is after I finished the college course.
Could you talk a little about the school, the community, Langston school community as you experienced it in that period?
Oh yes, I could talk on and on about it in those earlier years. Many students, a great many students had to work their way through school, and then there were those who were well-to-do and who were able to dress well and change suits frequently. And quite a number of the children, the youngsters, were like I was. My mother told me when we went there, because we were poor, that clothes don't make a man, and I accepted it. We had 2 old people over us in our dormitory who, in my opinion, shouldn't have been there because they would make remarks about students who couldn't dress, about you poor, ragged rounders. You've been used to sleeping in a dugout, but my mother told me that Fred, clothes don't make a man, and I just accepted what she told me, and it didn't matter about what they said. Many students had to work, and but they had high ideals. A great educator, Dr. Inman E. Page, who was the first Negro to graduate from Brown University in New England, in Rhode Island. He graduated there in about 1877 or about that time, and he was the first president of Langston University, a man of sterling character, and so a lot of us mocked him. People comment on my walking, the way I walk erectly and straight. That's because I copied walking after Mr. Page. The old man, all of those who knew him, he walked very erectly, and many of the boys tried to walk like Mr. Page. Our job was, my brother and I, milked cows, and then later on I ran the creamery, and that was a very good job because I could get some bread from the tables at the dormitory and take it down, and I'd separate that milk and have rich milk, half and half, and so I really had a good time with that kind of diet. That kind of food.
Can you think of any other individuals? You mentioned Mr. Page. Any other individuals in college who were particularly memorable, in either fellow students or teachers?
Yes, at Langston we had teachers like H.F. Mitchell, who was a math teacher, not a good teacher by his ability to teach math, but he had a splendid example that he always set for youth to follow. And that was one of our very good examples. And Mrs. Zelian Bro, the daughter of Dr. Inman E. Page, who was a music teacher and had charge of the band, later on taught here in Oklahoma City as the head of the music department under my supervision as principal of Douglas, but a great teacher, and quite a number of them like that. They were people of high character. That was one thing that was emphasized, good character, and persons who didn't have good character didn't last long at Langston University in the days of Inman E. Page.
Now you graduated from there what year from Langston?
Oh, I graduated from Langston the regular, what we call normal course. It was about 1919. It was 1919.
You were there during World War I then?
I was there during World War I.
Could you, of course, World War I obviously had some effect on everything, of course. And could you talk about the period of World War I and the effect it had at Langston and in other experiences you were involved in?
Oh, the most I think of in connection with Langston World War I, of course, there was a lot of drilling there. We had persons who had been a man, I've forgotten his name now, who had been in the army, who would train in. We had to do a great deal of marching and that sort of thing, and execution of orders just about like soldiers do, and that was carried on during that time on the campus. I presume it helped students to develop good posture by walking and standing erectly. That's the most I recall about it.
You went from there to the University of Chicago, is that right, or did you have a teaching period in between?
Well, what I did, I didn't have in the intent, first of all, to teach school, and so I took a period of about 2 or 3 years when I sold insurance. Was an insurance salesman for the American Woodman, a company that still exists. I think the headquarters is Denver, Colorado. I sold insurance for that company in Kansas City. And then in 1921, the year of 2021, a fellow with whom I associated in Kansas City, Missouri, we talked about what we were going to do, and I decided to come back to Oklahoma and teach school. And so I came back to Oklahoma and made my first application to teach a school. I don't know whether it'd be too much out of the way to tell you how I got that school, because it's truly an amusing incident how I happened to get my first school. It's truly a person never knows in life. Some things that happen, some things do happen that one doesn't really know. For instance, I'd been in the wheat harvest up here in the northwest part of Kingfisher County, up near O'Keene, about 9 miles from O'Keene. You'll remember that by a little town where they're near it, that they go out and try to catch rattlesnakes each year. Well, not far from O'Keene, and where I'd worked in the wheat harvest some, and I was stopping with a fellow who had an old T-model Ford, and he was to get me to Dover in Kingfisher County to catch a train. And he was one of these fellows who was habitually slow. Nobody could ever hurry him. His name was Will Jackson. So I kept trying to hurry Will, and he had 4 flats on his T-model Ford that morning. He kept saying, "Oh, that's all right, Fred, I'll get you there." That's my name. And when we should have been halfway to Dover, which was 22 miles from where I was, he started fixing flats. Well, anyway, he got on the road, and down the road he went in this T-model Ford, shuffling away as all the speed one could make. About 7, 8 miles, boom. And there was a flat. He calmly got out and fixed the flat, and I was pretty restless. But he started out again, passed through a little town that's now called Laurel. But in World War I, it was called Kiel, mostly made up of Germans, and because of the punished persecution that they suffered as being Germans in World War I, they changed their name from Kiel to Laurel. And that's the way it's named now, is Laurel, just a little east of Laurel. Some of you have been over in that area. You know there's a prairie dog town over on the north side of the highway there. He had his second flat, and about the time he fixed that flat, I could see the smoke of the Rock Island Railroad coming into Dover from the north, and I started fussing about you missing the train, but you can't quarrel very much with anybody who won't quarrel with you. And so we finally got to Dover. He went in by himself. I sat in the car pouting that I'd missed my train. And he came back and told me he could take me over to Crescent, and I'd catch a train to Guthrie from there. That's where I was going to get to Guthrie. And so he drove those 19 miles from Dover over to Crescent through the sand and what have you to get to Crescent. And when I got to Crescent, I noticed a 2-room frame school building in the Negro section at the northwest part of the town. The train that I would get to Guthrie was 2 hours and 45 minutes later. So I said, since I knew I'd planned to come to Oklahoma to teach school and didn't have a school, thinking maybe I'd teach in Lincoln County, county of my birth, but I said, here's a school, and I believe since I got 2 hours and 40 minutes here, I'll just make application and see if I can get this school. Well, to make the story short, I got to school. So Will Jackson's being slow was a blessing to me because he got the first school for me, and not only that, I lived there 10 years. I remained the principal of the Douglas High School, my first school, at Crescent, Oklahoma, for 10 years.
Can you talk about that school and some of the experiences you had at the Crescent School?
Well, yes, it's very easy for me to talk about that school and some of the experiences. I said first we had there were 2 rooms. It was a 2-room school, and it was very dilapidated. We started in there and had an old coal oil lamp upside the wall, and I started out early to try to make improvements, and went down and saw a board member of mine and got these gas lights, and him put the gas, you pump them up some kind of way. I'm not good mechanically, but they'll make a light. And that was an improvement of those lamps that you'd fill with oil and put on the walls to have the gas lights there. Then I was active with the children. I'd play baseball with them and what have you. And then after about my 3rd year, I was able to add another room onto this old building, which I know now was a mistake, because when we built this new room onto that old building which had been built there back in the 90s, that kind of fixed the thing where I should have delayed it longer, but having caught on to the era of having built that new one to place onto the old, I didn't make the same mistake. And so we met in churches around Crescent there for the next few years until we could get some estimate of the population, and then we built a new building, and that structure was there. We added to it some, but we built a new building. We were very happy to have that new building. We got some funds from Rosenwald to help to finance it, and left them with, when I left there, with 8 teachers, beautiful campus. I always liked beauty, and so we leveled the ground and sodded the grass and planted flowers, shrubbery all about it to make it attractive, and trees around on the yard. There are trees there now. There's a big tree there that I planted with my own hands. There's also one locust tree that I planted with my own hands. 2 trees there that I planted, and I'd go down out on the creeks where we could find them and get the boys, larger boys, to go with me, and we'd get these trees large enough to be planted and plant them to make the place a beautiful. Large enough to be planted and plant them to make the place a beautiful place. Spent 10 very happy years at Crescent, and I, of course, left there of my own accord to go to Wewoka.
Tell about the Wewoka.
After I left Crescent and was offered I was really elected, offered the principalship of Washington High School at Luther, and actually elected there, and some of 1931, but about the same time that I was elected principal of Washington High School at Luther, I was offered the principalship of the Douglas High School in Wewoka. But since I had already been employed at Luther, they had me to come to Wewoka in the night. Well, when I got to Wewoka, I liked the looks of the paved street. They had shrubbery, trees growing. At Luther, no reflection on the people there. They were very fine, but there were just blackjack trees growing around the building up there. And but at Wewoka, there had been some evidence of development of beauty, like shrubbery and grass. At any rate, I wanted to go to Wewoka, but I was under contract at Luther, and it took me about 3 weeks to get a release from my contract, so that I went on to Wewoka and served 9 very happy years in Wewoka, and had been reelected for my 10th year when I was elected principal of the Douglas High School in Oklahoma City, 7th of June, 1940.
Swinging back into your 2 smaller schools before you went to Oklahoma City, do you recall any students in either of these schools who possibly have made a name for themselves in one area or the other, or who have made a contribution that might be particularly worth mentioning in an order?
Well, I've had many students from schools who've been, they become teachers. Some of them have become ministers. And I'm trying to think of those that might be singled out. I know of a girl, Oleta Crane, who graduated from Douglas High School at Wewoka, the valedictorian of the class of 1933, who graduated later from Lincoln University in college and went into the Army for a career and went through the service and reached the rank of major in the Army and retired now. I believe Olita's living in Boston. Her sister Grace, who lives in Maryland, was by here to see me just a few nights ago, and Olita's in Boston. She's outstanding because of her contribution to the service. Oh, she was in a branch of the Army, but it was not the nurse corps. I can't. I'm not.
The reason I asked, the wax and the women's branches, most of them didn't open until World War II. That's why I wondered if it was one of the medical branches. You don't know?
I do not know. She was.
She could have come later.
She was later than that because she's a. It was a part of World War II, perhaps, that Olita was in, and then she was stationed in London. When I was abroad in 1955, I think Olita was in London at the time, but I didn't get in contact with her. Now let's see, I have just a great many of these students who spread out all over America. Oh yes, I know one that's real outstanding, it's well known. Juanita Kidd Stout, who is a judge in Philadelphia. She's quite well known. She has had a number of write-ups in the Daily Oklahoman. Juanita was a graduate of Douglas High School in Wewoka, class of 1935. Was a valedictorian of her class. I taught a class in problems in American democracy. I never thought of Olita being a lawyer, being admitted to the bar. She played music well and got a major in music from Lincoln University, Jefferson City, Missouri. But she went east and she became interested in the law and was a clerk for Judge Hasty, I believe his name was. And she wrote me, I got a letter from her one day that she was going to take the bar in Washington, and later she wrote me, sent me a copy of those who passed the bar, and she was one. So she's secretary to the federal judge. Later was circuit court Judge Hasty of Philadelphia, just retired a little more than a year ago. She was his clerk, and then of course she became a judge there in Philadelphia and is quite renowned for her work among youth in Philadelphia, and she has told me she plans to run for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Juanita is a Wewoka girl from Wewoka. Her mother still lives in Wewoka. Well, there are probably others that I'm not thinking about that I should. A number of them that are doing quite well in Los Angeles, California, and other places. And I'll probably get to see a great many of them. I go to San Francisco Thursday to the National School Board Association, and I plan to come back by Los Angeles so that I can get to see a lot of my children, as I call them.
This brings you to Douglas in Oklahoma City. We'll swing back into certain general experiences after we talk about this. But how don't you tell about your move to Oklahoma City?
Well, and the interesting thing about my move to Oklahoma City is still a case where I can say truthfully that the only position that I ever applied for was the one at Crescent, my first job. All the other jobs that I've held were offered to me, and so was Oklahoma City. I really had no thought of coming to Oklahoma City. As old timers know, Oklahoma City schools in the 30s had reached a very low ebb. Up in the what is now called the Carter Woodson School, is formerly the Douglas High School. Before we moved out on Eastern, if you go down on the south end of the corridor there, you'll see on the nameplate some names of members of the Board of Education. Well, at least two of those persons on that in that list, I believe, went to the penitentiary. If one didn't go, he was convicted and maybe got through various delays, didn't go. But the schools in Oklahoma City reached a rather low ebb, as you know, during the 30s, and the charges of selling jobs with a corrupt Board of Education was widespread. So when they changed superintendents and had a new superintendent, and I was teaching on the faculty at Langston University. I taught about 10 summers at Langston University, and I was there and got a call to come to Oklahoma City. It came from the superintendent of school, at that time, Herbert E. Wrinkle had just been elected superintendent, and I'd been a graduation speaker at schools, El Reno and also Bartlesville, where he was superintendent, and he'd heard me speak. At any rate, he called me and had me to meet him in room, I believe, 910 at what is now the Skirvin Hotel, not at the Board of Education building, for the interview. And then the offer came. He told me, he didn't promise it to me that day. He told me when I left his room, he said, "Now, I don't want you to talk about this, telling anybody, having anybody pulling for you. It isn't going to be filled by pull or politics." And I said, "Don't worry, I'm going out here at 736 Northeast 5th Street, get my wife and daughter, and go straight to Wewoka." That I did. And then my wife wanted to talk with me about it, but I thought perhaps it was just another interview, and I wouldn't talk. The next morning, I had a call from a former coach of mine, Vernon McCain, who was up earlier than I was and saw the Daily Oklahoma, to tell me congratulations. And I said, "For what?" And he said, "You've been elected principal of Douglas High School, Oklahoma City." And then I went out and got my paper off the porch, and it was there. So on the 7th of June, 1940, I was elected the principal of Douglas High School, Oklahoma City, where I remained 21 years and retired on July the 1st, 1961.
How did you tell about coming to Douglas High School and what it was like at the time you first came?
Well, when I first came to Douglas, and then the general situation that I've already referred to in Oklahoma City was quite depressing. If you had a minor job, in fact, I decided that I needed a night watchman for certain situation that I noticed was prevailing up here at what is now Carter Woodson, but was then Douglas High School, and I wanted to get someone for a night watchman there for perhaps 60 days. And how that leaked out, and I presume it was during the Depression, and I presume there must have been a half a dozen people who was trying to get that job, and members of the Board of Education were calling in about, "Why don't you take this one and that?" And more than one time, I sincerely wished I'd stayed in Wewoka, because I never had all that kind of interference about jobs. Then there was a minister here who, during my first year, and I shall never forget him, he was a well-educated man, but he wanted to peddle jobs. and he wanted to use me as an instrument for that purpose. And he would always come to my office after 5 o'clock, because I stayed at the office and worked late hours, and that people soon learn your habits. And he'd come in after 5, and he'd have this person that he wanted on. Most of them had been living in Oklahoma, knew fairly well that didn't offer very much promise of competency. So I didn't do what he wanted done. And so that first year was a very trying year, but I was determined, as Daniel in the Bible was when he was in a strange place, that he wouldn't defile himself. And so I resolved, under this pressure from this minister who was extremely smart, that I was not going to defile myself by engaging in any sellouts or that sort of thing. And at one of our churches, St. John Baptist Church, in the month of May, at the installation of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, I believe that Sunday, this same minister was there, and when the meeting was over, he followed me to my car. That was near the close of my first year. And he got in the car with me, and he said to me that I have worked with you diligently this year to try to get you to cooperate, and you have not. And he said, I've seen the list for next year. In those early days, they talked about lists, who's on the list for next year. And I've seen the list, and I'm sorry, Brother Moon, he said, you're not on it. And I said to him, as I well remember, just as well as if it were yesterday, I said, now, I want you and I have talked a great deal this year, but you've never become acquainted with me. There's certain things that I stand for. And I said, I stand for those principles, and whether I think if I do that, and that is do right, as you see the right, be just and fair to everybody, whether they be of high estate or low, and work hard. I say that's the philosophy by which I live. And I said, now if that won't work in Oklahoma City, you tell them to go ahead and fire me, because I have no intentions to change. But I think somewhere in the world that philosophy will work. And he said, I didn't mean to be impertinent. And I said, neither do I, but I do want to be, since we've talked so much this year, I want you to really understand me from this day forth. He never bothered me anymore. I stayed at Douglas High School 21 years, and the only reason I was out is because time caught up with me, and I reached retirement. I spoke on a program down here south of the University of Oklahoma on what was called those days Wings Over Jordan. And as I understand that program that morning, there were 119 radio stations hooked up to the program. And I made a speech that morning, and I received, and I have in my possession now, letters, cards, and maybe a telegram or two that came to me from all over the country from that, because of what I said in that speech, New York, California, and letters. But among those letters, the warmest congratulatory letter that I received from anybody came from this preacher that I have referred to from the state of Florida, who listened to me that morning. And so my philosophy of doing right as you see the right, and being just and fair to everybody, whether they have high estate or low, and work hard, prevailed. And I went on through my 21 years at Douglas very happily. and continue to have the support and best wishes of many people in Oklahoma City.
While we're on the philosophy, sort of, you told me before we went on tape of an experience about Johnny and about what someone told you was philosophy of leadership or something. Why don't you re-relate what you told me before we...
Let's see, what is that?
This was about the lady who called you about Johnny, and then it went on to what someone said about patience.
Oh, yes. This experience that I told about came from my pastor, who was pastor of Tabernacle, Reverend E.W. Perry, who was pastor of the Tabernacle Baptist Church, of which I'm now a member and have been since I came to Oklahoma City. He was pastor of Tabernacle Church for 50-some years, and he and I were great friends. He had a great sense of humor, philosophy, and he said to me one day, he said, "Frederick," my name's Fred, "Frederick, what is the greatest attribute in a leader?" Well, knowing that he was full of humor and funny tricks, I didn't answer, and I just said, "What is it?" And Reverend Perry said, "Patience." Well, I tried to exemplify that one morning when we were up at what is now Carter Woodson School, what then was Douglas, in the few years prior to our building the new Douglas High School out here. And the school was terribly crowded, so we had to, in order to take care of the students, we had to crowd almost 2,000 students in, had to crowd almost 2,000 students into the building. To do so, we had the 0-hour classes, that is an hour before the regular time scheduled, and I believe maybe we had some classes after the regular time. And during that time, with nearly 2,000 up there, I had an opportunity to test out what Reverend Perry told me about what's a great attribute in a leader: patience. A woman called me one morning with nearly 2,000 students there and said, "Professor, is Johnny there today?" Well, of course, with 2,000 students, I wouldn't know each one by his first name. And I at once remembered what Reverend Perry said about patience, and I comprehended that this is a woman who perhaps attended a rural school with 25 or 30 children in school, and so everybody was known by his first name. And so I said, Johnny, thinking maybe she would say the last name of the boy, and then I would keep from disappointing her by buzzing my secretary and getting her over there and then put my hand over the receiver while I told her to check on Johnny Jones or Johnny Smith, as the case might be, to see if he were there, and then I'd continue to visit with her about something, whatever it was, until my secretary came back to let me know whether Johnny was there. But be it as it may, it didn't work, and so I had to finally ask her. I said, Johnny, a third time, hoping she'd catch on and say Johnny Jones or Johnny Smith, but she just said Johnny, and I said, now let's see, what's his last name? And oh, she said, "Oh, Professor, say you know my Johnny," and gave it to me, but hurt nevertheless.
Can you think, let's think of some of your students at Douglas in Oklahoma City that you might be, their careers might be worth mentioning. I know it's harder in a big school to know those individuals than a small school because you get a 2,000 and how people we put in the count.
Let's see.
I'm sure many people who are leaders today in various communities or various efforts have gone.
Oh, yes, we've got so many of them. Oh, God. Let's see, I'm going to find.
We're talking about some of your students who have become prominent in different areas. Just a few. We're not trying to name them all or put one ahead of the other, but just think of some of the personalities.
Well, of some of my students who've been very successful, the number is so great that it's especially coming from Oklahoma City, also from Wewoka as well, where they've gone out throughout America and have made good. I think of Bosie Jackson in San Francisco, who has accumulated considerable wealth because of his ingenuity, and he's been engaged in honest endeavors. Of course, that happened to be a boy from Wewoka who's succeeding in a very fine business way there. In Oklahoma City, I'd like to call attention to John Townsend, Dr. John Townsend, who's on the faculty of the University of Oklahoma. John Townsend was once my paper boy, and I found out something from my father that I didn't know earlier. My father was with me years ago, and I had him under some specialists, and he'd still get up 4 in the morning, which I didn't understand, and but it was force of habit, and I couldn't get him to stay in bed. Well, I get up for years at 6 o'clock in the morning is my regular time, and I had John Townsend to become my paper boy. And I trained my boys, if he were to carry my paper, that I wanted the paper on the porch at 6 o'clock, rain or shine, sleet or snow. And I said, now, I pay for my paper. I presume I paid in advance for the Daily Oklahoman over a period of 30 years. Pay for a year in advance. And I would point out to my boy that if I pay for these papers by the year, so you never have to collect from me. It's just money in the bank for you, and you collect that. In addition, that if you deliver that paper as I want it, when I open the door at 6 o'clock in the morning, whether it's raining, whether it's sun shining, whether it's sleeting or snowing, I want my paper there. I said, then I give you a gift at Christmas time, in addition to the fact that you never have to collect from my paper. John Townsend, who is now a physician and now sitting on the staff of the University of Oklahoma Medical School, was one of my students, and John Townsend was one who always delivered the paper, rain or shine, sleet or snow, and he is, of course, making a success. There are other boys And girls who I grew up are also very successful. They do not come in the same category. I have a niece who is Vivian Moon, who is a pediatrician in Flint, Michigan. We have Dr. Sanford in this city, a nephew of mine, Dr. Moon, Dr. Wilson, so many of the boys who have studied the medicine, and girls who are outstanding in nurses, really too numerous to mention, and perhaps I made an error to ever start calling anybody's name. They'll forgive me if they hear it.
Let's swing back now into some of the problems. I mean, we've of course you have gone through quite a period, and we're still in a period of change where you have had the problems of decent financing for the separate schools, then the problems of that have come with integration, and with all of these have come many built-in problems that were bound to come, and many that are bound to continue. Why don't you discuss, as you experience, some of the problems that you have felt? Some of these may deal in governmental areas, some in local social
Some
areas.
that I have felt.
Yes.
Yes, I would be glad to cover it if it's appropriate.
Yes.
It's something where we have covered in our separate schools. That's Negro schools, if you'd like for me.
Yes, I'd like to do that.
When we come to our modern setup where we face what is called integration of schools, this occasion, of course, sets up a reflective mood in my mind, and I'm happy to go back to the days of separate schools where we, of course, face great problems. The law read that they shall be separate but equal. But if they are equal, there's no reason really to be separate. So, in fact, they were not equal. But I had the good fortune to serve as executive secretary of the Oklahoma Association of Negro Teachers. They call it black teachers now. We said Negro then. That's the victim of change. And I was executive secretary of the association, and then chairman of the legislative commission of the committee of the same organization over a period of 12 years. My main job was, of course, to watch and deal directly with the legislature and to see how it would be possible to get additional finances to make possible good schools for